Hello, and welcome back to the 41st Millennium. After a brief break period due to unforeseen circumstances, I have returned to bring a second Idiot's Guide to Dark Heresy into fruition. Now that we have gotten the basic rules out of the way, we can get into what a lot of people play Dark Heresy for. Messy, nail-biting combat encounters where every shot counts and one wrong move could be all it takes for a Chaos Psycho to seal you and your squadron of acolytes into the moon for 1,000 years. Combat is frantic, brutal, and will require a mixture of luck, skill, and several miracles to come out even of a minor scourge unscathed. But to overcome even your first clash with a humble Tyranid Gene Stealer, you must first understand how combat encounters work in this setting. Let's load our bolters, bear our vestments, and dive right in. So, the first thing to discuss when it comes to fights is the time frame they take place in. Unlike the abstract and vague narrative time that most of the game takes place in, which can cover anything from hours to weeks, combat, as well as other time-sensitive scenarios, takes place in what the rulebook calls structured time. This is a much more precise time frame, with each action eating up seconds on the clock. For example, while you could say 30 minutes of a session were equal to 3 hours of interrogation and questioning suspected heretics, if you're in the middle of a firefight and trying to keep a boiler from exploding and leveling a city block, you only have a set amount of turns before the boiler goes kablooey and your superiors are scraping your remains off the floor with a spatula. However, the switch from narrative to structured time also affects your movement. While in structured time, you have 4 speeds to travel at: a half move, full move, charging, and running. These are determined by your agility bonus, which is the tens value of your agility characteristic, and are calculated in meters because this is a game developed for a British created setting. Basically, each of these options have their own different pros and cons. A half move is the least distance but lets you perform a second action with your spare half action, more on that later. A full move uses both your half actions and moves twice as far, but there aren't any bonuses or penalties to performing it. A charge is another full action. It requires some setup to get working, but pulling it off properly grants you a plus 20 bonus on a single melee weapon attack or grapple attempt. And the very last option is running. This action covers the most distance and makes you harder to shoot until the start of your next turn, but makes you considerably easier to hit with melee strikes. As for narrative time, distance is calculated in how far you can move in a minute, hour, or a day. Normally, you could travel for a minimum of 10 hours, but you can keep going without penalty for an amount of hours equal to your toughness bonus. After that, you're going to start burning out your energy reserves and will need to pass tests to keep from taking levels of fatigue. The same goes for running, which lets you cover great distances very quickly but will burn through you just as fast. As a general rule, the more difficult traversing an area or obstacle is, the riskier it's going to be. This goes for climbing, swimming, and other forms of travel. However, you can use equipment like grappling hooks and harnesses to make these seemingly impossible tasks a little more manageable, but let's say you think traveling along the ground is for nerds. Personally, I prefer the air. Flight can come from any number of sources, both willing and not. But let's say your current mode of airborne travel was a willing gift and not because you were cursed by rubbing against the wrong artifact. On a planet similar to Terra, there are 3 altitudes you can fly at. Hovering, which is at the lowest of the ground and barely even counts. Low altitude, which puts you out of reach by melee but still very capable of being shot. And high altitude, which has you soaring over the range of anything people on the ground can throw at you. Keep in mind, this also applies to you. Also remember that it takes a full action to change altitudes, assuming you have the capability to do so in the first place, which most hovering creatures don't. And you need to make at least one movement action every turn, or you and the ground are going to have a very abrupt meeting. Now that we've covered the basics of moving around, we can get to the down and dirtying of ass kicking. To keep fights from devolving into chaotic slapfest and grenade-chucking madness, combat is split into 3 categories of time: actions, turns, and rounds. A round consists of every participant taking their turn in a set order, and each turn a combatant will perform one or more actions. The turn order starts from the top, which is determined by every player performing what is called an initiative roll. This is easy as can be. Every player rolls a 10-sided dice, called a D10, and adds their agility bonus to the rolled result, while the GM does the same for all NPCs at play. If any of the players rolls the same number as another, the two will fight to the death. Whoever has the higher agility score will go first, and if they both have the same score, then they roll d10s and the higher value wins. You place all the participants in order and the combat counter can begin. However, if one or more of the participants was caught with their pants down, then the first round of combat is going to be a surprise round. During a surprise round, all combatants roll for initiative as normal, but any surprised combatants lose their turn during this turn, and everyone else fights as normal. But surprised combatants aren't just rendered immobile during the first round of combat. All of the participants gain a plus 30 bonus to their weapon and ballistic skills against surprise participants, making them much easier to hit and risking taking them out of commission before they could even be a threat in the first place. Thankfully, if they manage to survive getting blasted at point-blank range with a Hellfire pistol, they'll be raring to go the next round of combat as normal. And let's say you finally get your turn in the initiative order. Now you get your chance to perform what Dark Heresy calls actions. These are, well, the actions you can perform in combat. Running away from a Tyranid swarm, chucking explosives down an elevator shaft, or even summoning the dark power of the warp. There are 5 types of actions, each having their own purpose in the flow of combat. You have full actions like sprinting toward an enemy at top speed. You can only perform one of these and will be giving up your other major option for this turn, half actions, which cover moves like attacking an enemy. You get 2 of these instead of just 1 like the full action, which is pretty sick if you ask me. The third type of action is your reaction, which will have 1 of each round no matter what type of action you use during your turn. This is more for defensive maneuvers when it's not your turn, like ducking for cover behind some rubble to avoid a heretic's bullet spray. The fourth type of action is the free action, which is anything basic that won't have any major play on the flow of battle, like a hand gesture or maybe singing a song of battle. The fifth and final action is the most unique, extended actions. These are for anything that would take a considerable length of time for you to complete, like ship repairs during an emergency, and as such require multiple turns to finish. Keep in mind, if you start an extended action, you need to be committed to finishing it, because if you're interrupted or abandon the action, all progress will be lost. There are also action subtypes. These don't affect gameplay, but help clarify what an acolyte can or cannot do during special circumstances. Keep in mind, the actions you can take during your turn are incredibly varied and diverse. This isn't like D&D where you just roll a d20 and hit someone with your mighty +1 stick of hurting and have a bunch of other actions you could use but completely forget they're there because almost every action you can perform in that game takes up a full action. Hell, in this game you can even attack twice in a single turn because attacking with a weapon is a half action, but that's far from the only option at your disposal. You could simply fire your bolt pistol twice and call it a turn, or you could be more cautious and use a guarded action that gives a slight penalty to any attacks you might decide to make this turn, but it also gives a slight bonus to your evasion rolls until the start of your next turn. Hell, maybe you don't feel like attacking at all, instead using a full action this turn to go into Overwatch to keep an eye out on a specific location and blast anyone who comes into your line of fire. Maybe it'd be smart to keep a heretic pinned to one spot using some suppressing fire. This is just scratching the surface of the options you have at your disposal, but listing them all would take forever. Keep in mind, however, your opponents have access to all the same combat maneuvers that you do, turning fights into extremely dangerous games of speed chess as you and whatever Xenos you're trading shots with outplay one another move by move. But hey, you fire off a shot. However, this cultist may have Poison Joke in place of a functioning brainstem, but he's not going to just stand there and take it if he has a chance to evade it. This will use his reaction to evade, and if he succeeds on the roll, the attack will be considered a miss. Here's how evading works. If this were a melee engagement, he would be able to either use the parry or dodge skills to avoid harm, but since he's getting blasted from 30 feet away, he can't exactly deflect a bolter shot and will only be able to attempt this with a dodge test. Keep in mind, not only do you get a single reaction every round, you can only use it when it's currently not your turn, so this isn't possible at all when you walk into the firing range of an Overwatch assault. Other things to keep in mind are that for attacks with multiple shots like semi-auto or full auto burst, passing the dodge test in the first place will only evade the first attack, and each degree of success you get on the roll, see my first Dark Heresy video for information on that, will evade an additional one. Now, you might be wondering, how does this affect AoE shit like explosives? Well, in that case, succeeding on the dodge test will put you at the edge of the explosion's blast radius as long as you can meet 2 requirements. Your agility bonus is high enough to move that far, in meters, so having an agility bonus of 5 will get you 5 meters away, and there's nothing obstructing your escape, like being trapped in a corner. If that happens, I hope your fellow acolytes are nice enough to gather all of your pieces in a KFC bucket after it's over. Unfortunately for the heretic, he wasn't fast enough to get out of the way of our fire, so it's a solid hit. Now comes the fun part, determining the hit location. We take the number rolled on the dice, in this case 32, and swap them around. Now we compare it to the hit location table as shown here. 32 becomes 23, and according to the table, that will land the shot squarely in the cultist's arm. Now, if we were playing an actual game and using proper enemies and NPCs, the enemies we would be facing would all have pre-made stat blocks and all that good stuff. But since this is less a fight to the death and more practicing on one of those gelatin dummies, let's say he's wearing some basic armor and nothing covering his limbs, so the only protection he has is his toughness bonus of 3. So when it comes to damage calculation, 3 points will be removed from the attack. But how is that done in the first place? Simple. Each weapon has a list of stats: range, damage and type of damage, the rate of fire, how well it penetrates armor, how much ammunition a clip will hold, if it uses ammo at all of course, how long it takes to reload, and if it has any special properties. For our demonstration, we'll be firing off a single shot, but the bolter is also capable of firing off semi-automatic bursts. It'll be hitting the cultist with explosive damage, and it has a penetrative value of 4, meaning a bolter will completely ignore the cultist's armor entirely. This is going to get very messy very quickly. But that's not all. The bolter also has the tearing quality, meaning you get to roll an extra die for damage and throw away the lowest result. Speaking of which, we'll be doing some serious hurt. 1d10 plus 5 damage. That means on top of the dice roll, we'll also be putting in 5 points of flat damage into this heretic. But wait, there's more! If we roll the maximum value for our damage dice, then we activate Righteous Fury.
I'll strike you down!
What's Righteous Fury? Well, if you manage to roll a natural 10 during damage, and the damage dealt isn't completely negated by armor or toughness, then something fun and messy happens. You'd best get out of the splatter zone for this. You roll a d5, then consult the critical damage effects table for whatever damage type you're dishing out, in this case, explosive, and apply the listed effect. So let's see. We rolled a 4, and after reading the listed critical damage for explosives to the arm, that will result in the sinew of their left arm being blasted clean off the bone like Grime getting hit with a power washer.
Ooh, nasty.
This stuns them for a round, but more pressingly, their arm is rendered useless until they can receive medical treatment, and they have to pass a toughness test or begin suffering from blood loss. Keep in mind, normally you would have to cut through your opponent's supply of wounds, we'll get to that in a hot minute, before dealing critical damage, and after this Righteous Fury is resolved, that fact still remains, so you don't get to cut out the middleman just because you got lucky on one roll. You should also keep in mind that your tools in a fight are just as varied as the options you can perform with these tools. Pistols, melta-guns, swords, knives, power claws, even pummeling heretics bare-fisted and grappling your opponents into submission or fighting with 2 weapons at a time instead of just using 1. Every weapon in your arsenal has different situations where they work best. For example, you might want to use explosives to clear out a crowd of enemies, or if, Emperor forbid, you want to take a suspect back alive, you may want to use hand-to-hand fighting and restrain him for further questioning. Yeah. As I alluded to earlier, combat is never this simple in a real fight. The example I gave was just for demonstration to explain the mechanics. Normally, there will be numerous other elements in play. The size of the enemy, terrain and weather impeding your ability to fight or even see, enemies ducking in and out of cover, even the range of different weapons making them more or less effective in different scenarios. For example, the only firearms you can use in close quarters melee engagement are pistols, and firing into a melee fight from outside could result in you shooting your allies by mistake. Oops. Hell, you can even defeat the forces of chaos with the unstoppable magic of friendship by ganging up on a single target in a group and getting a bonus to your weapon skill tasks as you beat them to death
with spears, shanks, and hammers.
But don't get thinking that on-foot combat is your only option. How else will you get to feel the ecstasy of crushing your enemies under the treads of a shadow sword? Land and air vehicles alike have their own sets of maneuvers and actions they can perform, like ramming into people or having a mounted gun that will tear small fry into shreds of chunky salsa. However, handling vehicles can be quite dangerous. For starters, to even operate a vehicle of any kind, you need the training and the operation skill relative to what you're trying to drive or pilot, like starships or land vehicles. Secondly, on top of rolling a hit location, you need to determine what side of the vehicle you're going to be attacking. This is called determining the facing and is incredibly important, because as a general rule, most vehicles place thicker armor on the front while the back is given less protection, making it an easier target. Every vehicle has 4 facings, and depending on where they're coming from, that's going to determine how much damage a vehicle's armor will absorb. Thirdly, just like the squishy party of acolytes piloting the vehicle, your ride is fully capable of taking critical damage. But unlike you, taking critical damage could result in your ride going out of control and crashing into a wall or worse, possibly killing the passengers in a bloody and messy wreck of steel and rubber. This is why wearing a seatbelt is always important, but while crashing can be extremely dangerous, taking serious amounts of critical damage could result in the death of your entire group in a fiery explosion, so having access to a vehicle can be both a blessing and a curse. Now it's time to describe the after effects of getting into fights, injury and harm. This is where wounds, bloodlust, and all that other good stuff come into play. Wounds are a measure of how much of beatdown you could take before damage starts getting serious. So let's say you have a wound threshold of 13. Until you reach that threshold, any damage you'll be taking will be relatively negligible. It's when you cap out that threshold that things start getting bad and you begin taking critical damage. Critical damage is a vast array of debilitating and eventually lethal effects that worsen as the damage climbs. For example, 2 points of critical damage from a melta to your chest will knock the air from your lungs and knock you prone, but otherwise you'll be fine. However, taking any additional points of critical damage will be cumulative. So, for example, 5 points of critical damage to your leg from a second shot will be 7 points of critical damage in total and will result in the targeted limb being broken and blackened, rendering it useless until you can get medical attention. it's certainly not a pleasant experience. There are actually a number of medical conditions you can suffer on your journeys across the galaxy. Lost limbs, being blinded, getting set on fire. None of them are particularly fun and often require medical attention if you can get them fixed at all. Hell, sometimes you might just need to cut your losses and replace your mutilated body with cybernetics to ascend into transhumanism. If an acolyte has taken damage to his wounds equal to or less than twice his toughness bonus, he is lightly damaged and will restore his condition through natural healing at the rate of 1 point every 24 hours. If she exceeds that limit, she becomes heavily damaged and will need to dedicate herself to healing with the Medicae skill or other means and will recover 1 point every 24 hours until she is below the threshold once more, whereupon she will be lightly damaged. Getting rid of critical damage is a bit more of a hassle. At the end of every 24-hour period while under medical attention, they can perform a challenging test and heal a single point of critical damage. But hey, that'll about do it for now. Hopefully I didn't forget anything important this time, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. See you all next time.